The Game Boy Advance had a strangely unique existence in that it was a console that was fundamentally designed for sprite-based 2D graphics, while polygonal 3D graphics were all the rage in the rest of the video game world. Through some programming magic, the GBA proved to be only just powerful enough to handle 3D, or at least pseudo 3D graphics, and because of the gaming landscape at the time, of course developers took it upon themselves to make 3D games. It was never a question of whether they should, it was a question of whether they could. In this video, I'm gonna timeline out and explore what was something of a fascinating rise of 3D graphics on the GBA by looking at the big milestone games, the ambitious tech demos, and the developers behind it all. But first, I want to give a little foreword on how I put this all together. A lot of you might remember that some years ago I made list videos where I looked at graphically impressive handheld games starting with the GBA, and through these videos I built up a knowledge of what games used 3D and how they achieved it. Now, there's no real wiki for this specific subset of games, and there's no comprehensive list of them anywhere, so I made my own spreadsheet of them for this video where I entered related data like release dates and metascores and developers and publishers, and through this I do graph out some trends and I do some data storytelling here. If you'd like to see the spreadsheet, it's linked in the description, and I do want to recognize that there are some potential pitfalls with my methods, which I've noted there too and tried my best to avoid. So with that all in mind, let's begin. Before anyone in the public even knew what the Game Boy Advance looked like, IGN leaked a very bare-bones dev kit in August of 2000, emphasis on bare bones. Supplied with the dev kits was a single-level demo of Yoshis Story, which showcased the GBA's impressive sprites and colors, some Mode 7 style stuff, parallax and zooming capabilities, and a particularly memorable pre-render of the rotating island. Now, while Yoshis Story was a 2D game, it was also a Nintendo 64 game, which served to bolster the pre-release hype for what the GBA was capable of. We all think of the GBA to be something of a handheld Super Nintendo, and this was the general sentiment back then too, where there were rumors of a port of the Super Nintendo's Yoshi's Island, which ultimately came to fruition. To unintentionally and unofficially introduce the console with a much more ambitious N64 port was a big deal. Only a couple of days after this, Nintendo would formally unveil the system in Japan with prices, dates, and more importantly, specs. Now, it's important to note again here that the GBA was not designed for 3D graphics, with Nintendo's executive vice president at the time specifically pointing out on announcement that the GBA is a dedicated two-dimensional platform in what seems like an attempt to shut down talk and rumors of it supporting 3D, of which there were many, with stuff like this purple Yoshi screenshot floating around online at the time, which just looked far too good to be true because it was probably fake. Early 2001 saw Nintendo announce more details about the system and its Western launch, where they revealed 15 launch titles. Among these, FZero Maximum Velocity showcased some impressive Mode 7-esque capability akin to the original SNES game. A lot more races would go on to do the same, and while it is impressive in its own right, I'll generally avoid talking about this graphics technique simply because there are much more ambitious graphics engines to talk about. Like for example, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 from that same launch lineup, which actually featured fully animated polygonal 3D models for the skaters that seamlessly blended into the pre-rendered environments in what ended up being a really great port of the game. More subtle uses of 3D like this can be seen throughout the GBA's library, like with the character models in Max Payne or bits and pieces of the environment in sports games. Hey, sorry for this really janky edit, but the later FIFA and Madden games by EA Big are actually a lot more 3D than I initially thought. I initially thought that they were just sort of like a scrolling background layer with 3D elements on top of that, but it turns out the entire environments in these games are basically fully polygonally 3D, which is really impressive. So I want to give credit where credit's due, and I'm very frustrated with myself for sort of not doing my due diligence and properly looking into these games. I think what this does is just highlight the challenges with making a video like this, because there's no sort of wiki or defined list of these games anywhere. Like there's over 1,500 games total on the GBA, and the only way of knowing if they're 3D is by simply seeing them in action or playing them for yourself, and even then you can miss some things like I did with these sports games, and even on top of that you do have to make a sort of arbitrary judgment call on whether they're 3D enough, in air quotes, for my spreadsheet. So yeah, anyway, these games are really, really impressive, and onwards with the video. It wasn't long before third parties would start making 3D tech demos as a way to attract publishers. Something to understand is that even though a console might not have dedicated 3D hardware, you can still in some sense brute force polygons if you want to, though you'd often preferably want to use some tricks to get around needing to. Like with the first major 3D-ish release, a port of the 1998 Windows shooter Backtrack by JV Games. A lot of you have probably already picked up on this, so I'll be quick, but this uses a graphics technique made famous by a lot of 90s PC shooters that's known as binary space partitioning, or BSP. Essentially, walls are drawn based only on what is in the player's cone of vision. The algorithm for it is deceptively simple, so it's very efficient for low-end hardware, but Backtrack isn't particularly impressive with its low frame rate and low draw distance. The most famous game that uses BSP is Doom, so naturally less than a month later, David A. Palmer Productions and Activision teamed up for a Doom GBA release, and the results are far, far better as it smoothly flows through much more geometrically complex levels with a seemingly unlimited draw distance. It's not a perfect version of Doom, especially with its lower resolution, which basically doubles the size of each pixel on the screen, and because it's based on the Jaguar port of Doom rather than the original DOS game, but critics and fans loved it, and apparently I ranked it as the best GBA first-person shooter around when I reviewed them all years ago, so it must be pretty good. I need a better memory. A third FPS came out less than a month later with the impressive X vs. Sever, and a company named Graphic State would try their hand at a BSP engine racing game in the Cruisin' series with Cruisin' Velocity, which wowed no one with its weird visuals and dodgy physics. Despite this, Graphic State would emerge as the first big player in the overambitious 3D GBA games world, not only with the smooth, charming Doom-like Dark Arena in January of 2002, but also with their tech demos, one of which in particular showed a GTA-like world where you could walk around in first person, get in and out of vehicles, see pedestrians and scrolling backgrounds, and even fly a helicopter. Like, this is really a sight to behold, even if it only lives on as an old blurry IGN video. They also released an impressive Star Fox clone in March with the creatively titled Star X, which marked the beginning of a handful of textureless polygonal games that would be released on the system. Star X in particular was exceptionally smooth considering how crowded it would get. 2002 really feels like the year of the GBA Tech demonstration, with random demos appearing left, right, and center, so another dev to emerge from this was the England-based GBA Games with their C2 engine. Among some really impressive racing demos, a soccer demo, and of course another GTA-style demo because it's the early 2000s, was a very impressive Quake proof of concept, which really made a splash. Considering the most complex game we'd seen so far was probably Doom, to skip all the way to Quake, even if it was only an empty 3D level, was huge. It was just unusual to see such complex angled geometry and high quality animated textures like this. The biggest splash in the incredibly niche GBA 3D tech demo world at the time was from an Italian developer named Ray Light Studios, who debuted their Blue Roses engine with a large handful of demos that were all, at the time, jaw-dropping. Most famously out of these was a Metal Gear Solid test scene, which showed a well-modeled version of the PS1 game's opening area with full texturing, including animated water, and some Resident Evil test scenes, which showcased very impressive 3D character animation that was apparently mocapped, which just blows my mind. Raylight later even created a very famous demo of Resident Evil 2 in the hopes that Capcom would hire them for the port, but they were unfortunately denied. Oh, what could have been. As far as games that actually came out goes, we went from 4 notable releases on my spreadsheet in 2001 to a whopping 15 in 2002, which I think just speaks to the developers figuring out how to use their engines. A very unknown company called Sonari Interactive ported Driver 2 down using a BSP engine, which might not look like much, but it was a technical achievement with its massive open world cities where you could both drive and walk around on foot, its good physics system, and its good police AI. Like, it's surprising how well this captures the essence of Driver 2. Rebellion Developments, who you probably know as the developers behind Sniper Elite these days, had a particularly weird year on the GBA in 2002. Their first release was in May with a Tiger Woods game that rendered still frames with voxel graphics, which I believe is the first appearance of voxel-based graphics on the GBA. This was a technique popularized by a company named Nova Logic on 90s PCs. Like, you might remember games like Comanche or Delta Force which used it, and it basically renders a height map using vertical lines in your cone of vision. It's hard to explain quickly, but this fantastic visualization by a guy named Sebastian Macke helps a lot. I'll include a link to his amazing article explaining the tech in the description. Again, like BSP, using voxels in this way serves as an unconventional but inexpensive method of creating 3D graphics, which is exactly why it's used here on the GBA. Tiger Woods PGA Tour Golf doesn't move around in the Voxel world. Like I said, it just renders single frames, but Rebellion would follow it up in September with a port of Rockstar's Smuggler's Run, which animates this voxel world effortlessly. Granted, the voxels themselves, being the cubes this world is made up of, are pretty large, meaning they're easier to work with from a technical perspective, and the draw distance is quite low, particularly when compared to later voxel-based games, but considering how early this came out, it is a real achievement. Rebellion closed the year with an absolute disaster of a game. Medal of Honor Underground is considered to be maybe the worst GBA game ever made. It's certainly the worst one I've ever personally played, and I think this footage of it just speaks for itself. It's just a slideshow of endless muddy pixels, making it near unplayable. Again, Rebellion had a really weird year on the GBA, so weird in fact that I guess they just gave up on the console for good, releasing no more games on it from this point forwards. Thankfully, to make up for that awful FPS, FZero got something of a sequel remake thing to tie in with the film that was pretty competently put together visually, though it did bite off a bit more than it could chew, with weapon scopes and ladders and innocent bystanders and alarms and multiple campaigns. I guess it's just interesting to see such an overly complex shooter on the system. For something more straightforward, Aussie dev Taurus Games released two of the best FPSs to ever grace the GBA with Duke Nukem Advance and Doom 2, both of which raised the technical bar for FPS games to a point that could be argued was never met again by any other dev but Taurus themselves, featuring complex levels with sliding doors and multiple different floor elevations with detailed textures on all surfaces that could change with damage, all while supporting many sprites and running at a smooth frame rate. These games' biggest achievements are simply being filled with character and just being fun. It's really not hard to get sucked into these and see them as more than just impressive tech, and in hindsight, these two games and the first Doom are by far the gold standard first-person shooters on the system because they're just that good. Sega got THQ to publish a GBA Monkey Ball game which fared very well thanks to its minimalist look, and its simple gameplay justifies the use of 3D graphics better than most games, though playing Monkey Ball with a D-pad should be a crime. Really though, there's only one release from 2002 that stands head and shoulders above even the tech demos, and that comes from French duo Velez and GBA, who I've talked about a lot in the past. They were all about pushing hardware to its limits, especially on the Game Boy Color prior to this, with a good line of impressive races that are among the best on the system from a technical standpoint. Only midway through 2002, Velez and GBA debuted their V3D engine with V-Rally 3. This game is just incredible. Geometrically dense and very complex environments with banks and hills and buildings and angles with effortlessly blended scaling sprites for trees and objects, all while still maximizing its use of the GBA screen resolution and being smoother than virtually any game we've looked at so far. It also sports well above average car physics, has a cockpit view for that extra rally feel, and it has race modes with other cars on the track. Like, this game really is a sight to behold, and the devs themselves have described it as one of the most important moments in their lives as developers. It really does feel like a watershed moment for them, as they'd set a new bar for both themselves and for the GBA, and they would only exceed that bar in years to come. 2003 saw the GBA start slowing down and changing direction a bit. After over 600 game releases total in well under 2 years, averaging about a game per day since the Japanese release, 2003 had about 100 fewer games come out when compared to 2002, and the trend continues downwards. The market was just so oversaturated because development costs were so low, and there's an easily observable trend towards children's games even within the first year of the GBA's lifespan. As such, by my data, FPS games on the GBA went from 3 releases in 2001 to 6 releases in 2002, followed by merely 1 release per year up until and including 2006. 2003's FPS game was something of a demake of 007 Nightfire by JV Games, the same dev who kicked off these FPSs with Backtrack. Though this might not look like much on first sight with its lower frame rate, it's a lot more interesting than you might expect. With its complex 3D geometry showcasing things like ramps and furniture and mounted turrets in full polygonal 3D, this seems to use a more traditional engine rather than a BSP-based engine like we'd seen in the past. What this means is that there's a lot less right angles, a more liberal use of texturing, and a lot more 3D objects everywhere. On top of this, the muzzle flash from your gun seems to light up the environment close to you, which really is something else on the GBA. So while I said Taurus's Doom 2 and Duke Nukem games are probably the most impressive on the system, particularly thanks to their frame rate, there's definitely an argument to be made for Nightfire. In place of all the first-person shooters, and while we're trending towards more family-friendly games, driving games took over the 3D GBA mantle from this point forwards. Sega Rally Championship had a decently fun GBA port, though it wouldn't hold a candle to V-Rally 3, mostly because of its much lower resolution. LEGO Drone Racers would really impress with its smooth frame rate, having a gorgeous Super FX style look that took advantage of pastel colors, saving the need for expensive textures. Velez and Jubail knocked it out of the park again with a port of Stuntman, improving the engine to include moving 3D objects and much more complex levels, which evolved visually as you drove through them, all while just being a lot of fun to play. Just an interesting note about the V3D engine, something distinguishing about it is that at the bottom of the screen, the polygons typically appear to sort of warp or bend, which indicates that the 3D graphics aren't rendered in a very entirely perspective correct way, assumedly in order to run smoother. I find it sneakily clever how V-Rally 3's cockpit view covered it up though, which feels like a two birds with one stone move. A company called Skyworks Technologies took the reins from Rebellion for Voxel engine-based games, releasing Quad Desert Fury, which looks far better than it plays, having a much higher fidelity engine than Smuggler's Run did, with smaller voxels and a longer draw distance, though its physics and driving model suffer assumedly because of this. Still, these voxel games never fail to amaze me. One of the most notable releases from 2003 is actually a Nintendo-published game, the only Nintendo-published game on my spreadsheet, which was a huge deal on the GBA. It was actually published by Kemco in PAL regions and in Japan, but with a library as oversaturated as the Game Boy Advance's was, having Nintendo behind your project, even if it was just in the US, was a godsend in exposure alone. The game was called Top Gear Rally, developed by the Australian Tantalus Media, who actually quietly released a couple of races on this engine in the past. This was where they really nailed it though, and got the appropriate recognition because it's a very, very strong rally racer with truly weighty, realistic controlling cars that are modelled in full 3D. As a whole, this isn't as impressive as V-Rally or Stuntman, but it boasted the largest 3D models around at the time with the cars, and the gameplay itself was unmatched when it came to realistic driving. It was also the first, or one of the first GBA games that I personally ever owned, so I'm pretty sentimental about it, and maybe it's indirectly the reason that I'm making this video today, but trust me, it is a genuinely exceptional game. Graphic State made a reappearance after bursting onto the scene early with those decent published games and those particularly impressive tech demos like that open world one, and in the same vein as that demo, they made an open world Crazy Taxi spin-off which bit off a bit more than it could chew with its low res and frame rate, but this does feature surprisingly large, detailed, and complex open levels, especially when compared to its contemporaries like Driver 2. It also features a lot of sprites on the screen at once. I just wish that it handled it all better. Raylight finally debuted their Blue Roses engine in not one but two commercial releases. Wing Commander Prophecy is one of the most ambitious and complete games on the system, being an attempt at porting the full version of the PC game down to the GBA, and mostly succeeding. There's heaps of 3D models in the game for the ships that are smartly used sparingly to avoid slowdown, and there's some good simple weapon and explosion effects to help sell it all. It's not the most impressive game visually, but it is very, very impressive in its scale. Raylight's other game was Ozzy and Drix, a 3D side-scroller based on the cartoon of the same name, and it's an awful game with some decent visuals. Large models that animate this much is unusual, it's generally nicely uncluttered, and there's even some driving sections and cutscenes thrown in. Both Raylight's offerings in 2003 were above average visually, but they weren't getting close to the tech demos we'd seen from them in years prior, and they were getting beat out by the competition, which was a bit disappointing. Speaking of big tech demo companies finally releasing games, AGB Games, the guys behind the Quake demo, renamed to Pocketeers and released a port of Need for Speed Underground, which didn't look great with its lowered res and busy visuals, but it did at least play well, and Pocketeers went on to sort of redeem themselves by releasing another 4 really impressive Need for Speed games over the next few years with vastly improved visuals. Now, while there were still tech demos and new engines popping up here and there throughout 2003, like, for example, this trailer for a cancelled third-person shooter called Radium, which shows some impressive camera movement and even what looks to be an attempt at a reflection in a mirror, the excitement for 3D on the GBA was quickly dying down among the small amount of those who cared. You can see critic reviews turned from excitement to disdain when it comes to 3D graphics, as they often just call it a gimmick, and while there were still good games coming out that were 3D, the novelty was wearing off, and there were much more poorer games coming out too. Quad Desert Fury, Ozzy and Drix, Cruisin' Velocity, Medal of Honor Underground, and a whole bunch of other games on my spreadsheet that just haven't even been worth mentioning completely bombed, where the 3D just felt like a hindrance that only served to help sell the game through screenshots on the back of the box. One of the more impressive engines from 2003 that we wouldn't see until years later was this one, named DR Advance by a company called ProGraph Research. It had a multitude of impressive features and ran at a high frame rate, but never saw a commercial release in any way because they couldn't land a publishing deal that was worth going through with. Stories like this aren't unusual, and a dev at ProGraph said this about it. Our idea was to generate interest in the engine and in case propose a formula-like without a license. Unfortunately, though the interest was high, the profit margin offered was too low, as the GBA market became saturated very quickly and third-party products usually sold very few copies. I find this quote to succinctly speak to the state of affairs going into 2004, which was the year the Nintendo DS came out, as well as the PSP in Japan. Like, to think that something like Ridge Racer on the PSP came out alongside these 3D GBA games is a really funny thought to me. I think it just goes to show how quickly hardware was advancing at the time. That's not to say that there weren't some really impressive releases in 2004 though. Hot Wheels Stunt Track Challenge continued the gorgeous textureless look on, and I often see Velez and Jubail's Asterix and Obelix XXL being used as the go-to game for showing off GBA 3D, where they made a platformer rather than a driving game, and of course knocked it out of the park again with some almost PS1 grade visuals. I know that's hyperbole, but the way their 2D sprites flawlessly scale while animating is just amazing, and there's usually so many of them on the screen at once, and it all just looks exceptional. I can't praise these guys enough. A developer named Visual Impact made a couple of reasonably impressive SSX games for EA in years prior, but in 2004 they stepped up their game with a port of Kill Switch, which is a full-blown cover shooter on the GBA, a novelty in and of itself. It has a polygonally 3D player character that animates very well, and it all runs very smoothly with a lot going on at once, standing as the most anachronistic title so far. One of the more well-known uses of 3D comes from the GBA's Grand Theft Auto spin-off, which used polygons for some environmental stuff like the buildings and street lamps. This isn't the most impressive use, but with all its gameplay systems running at once, it's cool that it could also run so many fully textured 3D buildings on top of everything else. It's also a good game, and honestly, games that use 3D sparingly typically are more fun. In the same vein as GTA, there was a fan-made GTA clone called Payback, originally made for the Amiga back in 2001, which is an unusual time for an Amiga game to come out, and I don't like using the term GTA clone, but this was, with all respects, initially made as basically GTA on the Amiga. In 2003, it was ported to Mac, and in late 2004, it found itself as an official release on the Game Boy Advance, where it was apparently finished quite a bit earlier, but the dev couldn't get a publisher until Destination Software picked it up. My only source for that is an unreferenced paragraph on Wikipedia though, so take it with a grain of salt. Regardless, Payback is one of the most technically complex games on the system, where, unlike GTA, almost everything here is polygonally 3D, from the pedestrians to the cars to the buildings, and it's almost all textured. On top of that, it's filled with impressive visual effects like car shadows, human shadows, skid marks from tires, smoke from damaged cars, and particle effects which are shown off with some very silly bullet and blood decals. It even sports some fairly realistic car crash physics to top it all off. It's not as enjoyable of a game as GTA, partly because it lacks character, but it's certainly more flashy, and it has more bells and whistles than any other game we've looked at or will look at. We also finally got to see Raylight's Blue Rose's engine put to really good use in a commercial product in 2004 after Wing Commander and Ozzy and Drix didn't quite live up to the tech demos. Smashing Drive is an arcade taxi driving game with heavily scripted linear stages, filled with shortcuts and 3D models everywhere, many of which can be bumped into, and they will react appropriately. It's very, very dense and busy, and like Stuntman, the stages are multifaceted where the environment around you feels handcrafted and continuously changing. The sheer amount amount of detailed polygons streaming in and flying past at any given time is what makes this one so special. It's straightforward in the tech that it uses, but it's cool to see it done so well at this level. It's 2005, the PSP releases in the West, and the GBA continues to slow down, but again, that didn't stop there from being some particularly interesting games. Taurus returned after 3 years of non-FPS games to remind the world just how good their engine is with Ice 9. David A. Palmer, the mysterious and talented programmer behind the awesome 2001 Doom port, returns to the scene with a competent but somewhat visually dated Tokyo Extreme Racer spin-off of all things, and Raylight release a laggy port of Street Racing Syndicate, which is only notable for its huge car models. Raylight's other 2005 release, Big Mother Truckers, yes that's what it's called, stands out because it's also on the DS running on this same engine. The GBA version is essentially the exact same game, just with every level of detail aspect to it scaled down or turned off. It's impressive in the way that Blue Rose's engine is usually impressive, and the sheer scale of it with the bigger open levels probably makes it Raylight's most ambitious GBA game, which is fitting since it's their last. The fact that this is a one-to-one remake of a DS game that's impressive in and of itself is a big part of the novelty here, and it's just bizarre that this game even exists, not only because the PS2 game it's based on is so bizarre, but also because these DS and GBA ports came out 3 years after it. Weird. What I believe is hands down the most technically impressive 3D game ever released on the GBA, the sort of pick of the bunch, the most mind-blowing one, is Velez and Jubale's port of Driver 3, and I'm not just saying that because I love Driver 3. In fact, in terms of playability, this is Velez and Jubale's least fun GBA game, but man, they combined the on-foot stuff from Asterix and Obelix with the driving stuff of their earlier games and built 2 massive open-world cities that mirror their console counterparts in scale to create another game that's comfortably above all others, even Velez and Jubale's prior work. It's truly incredible, and the fact that it's directly comparable to the main Driver 3 game speaks wonders to its achievements. I made a full video talking about this game in the past, and I'll link it below in the description if you want to know more, but man, this game is just something else. We're really in the dregs now. There's just 6 notable 3D games that came out in 2006, and I'd say only 2 of them are passably enjoyable, with Pocketeer's final Need for Speed game and final game ever as a developer, and Visual Impact's Tony Hawk Downhill Jam port, which is the peak and finale of that sexy flat-shaded polygons look we all know and love. What's peculiar about 2006 is 3 voxel-based games came out, doubling the amount of voxel games total on my spreadsheet. They were all by Skyworks, who did that Quad Bike game in 2003, and these are very similar to that, with one of them straight up being another Quad Bike game, so I guess they just wanted to maximize the use of this engine while they still had the chance. Of course, the final 3D GBA game and only entry on my list from 2007 is Cars Made a National Championship. There is no escape. Tantalus dug up their engine for the first time in 4 years since Top Gear Rally for this, so it's actually a decent little game with good models again, but yeah, I'd say that the fact that we started with big gaming IPs like Doom and Duke Nukem and Resident Evil, and ended up with cars and some random monster truck and quad bike games, speaks to where the GBA ended up as a whole, oversaturated and aimed at kids. But this isn't where our story ends. In the years since, much more has been discovered with tech demos and unreleased games coming to light, like in 2011 with a ROM of a voxel-based version of Banjo Pilot, which was leaked online. Now, Banjo Pilot did actually commercially release in 2005, but the final version was more of a Mode 7 style racer, whereas this 2004 build featured an impressive voxel-based world. It was changed simply because it was too laggy, but it's fascinating to see, and I suspect it would have been the most fun voxel-based game had it come out. Developer Shin En, who you might know as the German developer behind The Tourist and Fast RMX recently, had an unreleased 3D GBA racer prototype surface online in 2012 that was originally made all the way back in 2001. Early on, this dev did actually make a couple of really impressive scrolling shooters on the GBA with Iridian and Iridian 2, which featured amazing pre-rendered backgrounds, so I wanted to acknowledge them as one of the bigger hardware pushes on the platform, and this impressive demo only helps back that up. The vehicle selection select menu in particular is impressive, assuming it isn't pre-rendered, as it shows the shading change on the models as they rotate. 2012 also revealed that Virtua Racing was almost ported to the GBA, as third-party publisher Dream On Studios pitched this demo to Sega back in the day. It appears to be a strong port of the game, but we don't actually know when it was developed. If this was as early as 2001, then it's really amazing, and even if it came out towards the end, it's still well above average. Regardless, it's cool to see what's always been a hardware-pushing game pushing more hardware. In 2015, a Mario Kart prototype called Mario Kart XXL was revealed by a channel named Steven78 as a top-down racer that featured 2 scaling and rotating background Mode 7 style layers, something that hasn't otherwise been done on the GBA. Originally made in 2004 for Nintendo, it doesn't appear to have anything more traditionally 3D going on, unless Mario and his titular kart are 3D, but I'd guess that they're pre-rendered. Still, it is an unusual sight, especially because it's Mario Kart. As is this voxel-based shooter also found in 2015 based on Frank Herbert's Dune called Dune Ornithopter Assault, a game that was basically finished but cancelled in 2002, which would have made it the most impressive voxel-based release at the time since it was only against Tiger Woods and Smuggler's Run. The big heads-up display does limit the screen area a lot to squeeze the most out of the engine, but this is otherwise a remarkably smooth and ambitious helicopter game in the vein of Comanche, or Ornithopter game rather, sorry. New information and prototypes and demos are still being revealed even as recently as last year, like these 2 demos by NDWare and C4 Digital, which were uploaded on YouTube by PTOP Online. One is a Quidditch demo with a fully modelled character, and the other is a tennis demo with 2 fully modelled characters, and they're both very smooth, though they're also very bare bones. Interestingly, on the Quidditch demo, a splash screen for Climax appears, who were the developers behind that Hot Wheels GBA game, as well as the not great Serious Sam GBA game, so it's speculation, but maybe that implies that these demos are running on Climax's engine. As for how the developers went after this, Velez and Jubail continued to release insanely impressive handheld games on the DS and 3DS, and are still operating to this day, releasing Rise Race the Future in 2018, though tragically Fernando Velez passed away in 2016, so they had to do some restructuring. Raylight Studios appears to be doing well, and apparently they're building upon their Blue Roses engine as it now supports the Switch, Xbox One, and PS4, which is just amazing considering it started here with those tech demos. Taurus continued strong as a budget developer, just recently releasing the Praetorians HD remaster, as did Tantalus, who have even had some high-profile projects recently with the City Skylines and Zombie U ports, and most famously, the Twilight Princess Wii U port. Go Australia. And that's a general timeline of 3D graphics on the GBA. Despite all those amazing early tech demos, there was never a big 3D release on the system, which speaks not only to its saturated library, but also to how gameplay was often sacrificed or simplified just so these games would actually run. I mentioned this earlier briefly, but in some sense there is a direct correlation between how limited the use of 3D is and how good the game is. Games that only use a hint of it, like GTA or Max Payne or Tony Hawk, fare far better than comparable 3D games because they feel like more than just glorified tech demos. Still though, this stuff will always be fascinating and impressive to me at least, and I hope you enjoyed joining me on this exploration. And with that, we wrap up my longest video yet. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a bunch of old videos that goes in depth into some of the games I've talked about here. So like I said, I have a full review of Driver 3. I also have a full review of Max Payne on the GBA. I also have a video about every Need for Speed game on the GBA, as well as every FPS game on the GBA, though that one's a bit older and not as good. And yeah, I did those 5 graphically impressive videos years and years ago, which probably not worth watching now that you've seen this, but if you're curious, I probably talk about a few more games that aren't mentioned here. And I've also done videos on the Tony Hawk GBA games. Basically, it made sense for me to do this video. It felt like all things led to here. So yeah, I'll link everything in the description. So if you want to check out more, that's what you can do. You can also support me on Patreon. Like this stuff takes a lot of time and research and effort, and I do appreciate your contributions. So I'd like to thank all of my patrons, including the ones coming up on the screen. and especially including my $5 patrons, Adam Beals, Analog Man, Anthony Heisel, BC's Gaming Shelf, Blake Barnett, Boggy Online, Caden the Dingo, Chef, Chris Bushkas, Devin Grandal, Dominic Chikoki, Gary Pay, James Lock the Large, Labcat, Lachlan Jones, Lucas Raysevic, Maximilian Kunzman, May Aris Mazaki, Melanie G, Minimme has wares if you have coin, Mustache Duct Tape, Mrs. Minimme, Peaceful Kumquat, Plague, Ritalin for Kids, Tia, Test Drive Unlimited 2, The Mighty Mega Link, Thomas Damsgaard, Traplaw Ross, Travis, Trevor Corbin, Trixie Emerson, Under 10 Hours, Who Walks with Fergus, Riding on Games, and Zindictive. Thank you all for supporting. If you've watched this far, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take it easy.